keep pushing. Bill agrees with you. He just can't say so right now. And a month later, the Canadian Department of National Defence signed a transfer arrangement with the government of Afghanistan. And I can only assume that that was done on the instruction of Bill Graham. Now, it just so happened that the Liberal Party and Bill Graham, as the cabinet minister responsible, were in the midst of an election campaign when that arrangement was signed. It was signed by Rick Hillier on behalf of Canada. And the arrangement was not nearly as rigorous as it should have been. I mean, I know this because subsequently I and Amir Attaran, a heroic figure in this story, acquired detainee transfer arrangements that other NATO countries had done with Afghanistan in the months before we concluded ours. And their arrangements were so much better than ours. Ours simply said, we're handing over these prisoners, you have to promise to treat them properly, and you have to promise to let the International Committee for the Red Cross visit them, and that's it, essentially. Professor Attaran aptly called it a detainee laundering agreement. Now, the British, in contrast, or the Dutch, or the Danish, said, oh, we're transferring, you have to treat these people properly, and we have a right to come and check whenever we want to make sure that you're doing that. And not just us, but the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Torture can come and visit them at any time that he or she wants. And also, if you change anything concerning their situation, their location, you have to tell us. And, oh yeah, by the way, if you want to transfer them to another country, you have to get our approval first. Kind of stuff you would hope to see, and the kind of stuff that Rick Hillier presumably knew about, because, again, these were agreements signed by NATO countries, and he must have had them on his desk. Or whoever drafted our arrangement must have had them on his or her desk, and we chose not to follow those models of best practice. And we've paid a price for that. And Professor Attaran and Alex Neve from Amnesty International Canada and I told the government again and again, look, this arrangement is inadequate. This arrangement will cause problems. I remember testifying in December 2006 to the House of Commons Defense Committee and saying, look, it's easy. Take the British agreement, do a search and replace function on the computer, okay? Type in United Kingdom, search, replace with Canada. Push the button, you've got your new transfer arrangement. It's as easy as that. Oh no, we don't need to do this. This is, we're fine. We trust the Afghan authorities. Or perhaps the worst argument of all is if we don't trust them, they won't develop into the kind of functional human rights respecting state that we want. That we're trying to rebuild their country. We shouldn't be looking over their shoulder all the time. Ask any parent of a 5-year-old whether that's necessarily a good approach. Yes, you have to give them some freedom, but you also have to make sure that they're playing within the lines. And Afghanistan, of course, is a country where the concept of human rights is not perhaps as deep and as long-standing as in a country like Canada. And it all blew up in the government's face. About a year ago, in the spring of 2007, thanks in large part to some investigative journalism by Graham Smith from the Globe and Mail, who did something a little bit unusual for a Canadian journalist in Kandahar. he went off the base without military minders. And he started talking to ordinary Afghans. And he actually found some people who had been prisoners of Canada, who had been transferred to the Afghan authorities, and who were claiming to have been tortured. Claiming to have been tortured. None of this has been adjudicated. No one can say that these people were tortured. But they're allegations of torture. And some of them were quite serious. Perhaps the most serious included one man who said, the Canadians were just outside while I was being tortured, and they must have heard my screams. Again, it's just an allegation, but a couple of dozen of individuals claiming that they had been mistreated once they had left Canadian hands. And again, this allegation that Canada was not just playing fast and loose with the transfers, but actually knew that something untoward was going on. And this caused a storm in the House of Commons. It caused the Prime Minister to say, I think, the worst thing that he's ever said, which was to suggest that those of us who were concerned about the rights of the prisoners somehow didn't care about Canadian soldiers. And this is where I want to come back to something I touched on before, about how these rights, these obligations are not just moral or legal, but also have practical consequences. One of the reasons why international humanitarian law has rules concerning prisoners of war, including a prohibition on any torture or mistreatment, is because soldiers have realized for decades that there's a practical reason for encouraging people to surrender in circumstances where they are faced with certain death. I mean, think about it. If you are a soldier and your back's to the wall, you're facing a larger, better equipped force. If you know that if you put down your weapon and put up your hands, that you will be taken into custody and well treated, and then released at the end of the hostilities, not having been punished for fighting in the war, you're probably going to put down your weapon. But if you think that there's a danger that once you surrender, you will be tortured, you're going to fight to the death. And people who are fighting to the death are very dangerous to those who they are fighting against. And so if the insurgents in Afghanistan have any reason to believe that they will be tortured if they surrender to Canadian soldiers, they're going to be less likely to surrender, and that will increase the risks to our soldiers. So, just to make sure that you followed this, by not caring sufficiently about the rights of prisoners in Afghanistan, it is possible that Mr. Harper and his colleagues have actually indirectly caused the deaths of some Canadian soldiers. So, who cares about our soldiers more? The Amir Attarans or the Stephen Harpers? Think about it. And I can tell you, because I know this, that even those who, in their political and bureaucratic deliberations, think that torture is not so bad, or that sharing intelligence with states that torture is not so bad, or turning a blind eye to CIA planes refueling in Gander is not so bad, that those sorts of people retreat quickly from those positions when their behavior is brought into public view. Which is why I will close with this. I'm confident that another Canadian, a young man named Omar Khadr, will actually come back to Canada one day. And I won't give you the full story of Mr. Khadr, apart from saying that, like many of you and like I, he is a Canadian citizen. And he has been held in a legal black hole for around 6 years now. He was taken there as a child, and he has almost certainly been tortured in some way. And while every other Western ally of the United States has repatriated its nationals from Guantanamo Bay, Canada has not done so with respect to Mr. Khadr. And it is a shame and a stain on this country that he remains there today. A U.S. naval officer named William Keebler, who, in representing Mr. Khadr over the last number of months, has brought this into the spotlight in a way that is beginning to put real pressure on the Harper government, which of course does not want to bring Khadr back to Canada for a complex range of reasons, including probably, a light dash of racism. But the pressure is building, and people are starting to remember Omar Khadr's name. They're starting to see the incongruity of Guantanamo Bay and Canadian citizenship, at a minimum, at least. And of course, there are the hundreds of other men who probably shouldn't be there either. But Mr. Khadr, I think, will one day, in all likelihood, go free. At which point, I'd love to have him as a student at UBC. Because we can't write people off because of our assumptions or because of what might have happened to them through our negligence, or brand them as criminals because of what we think their parents might have done. The whole principle of a rule of law is to treat each individual as an individual and to recognize and uphold their individual rights. And in a country like Canada, with so much that has gone on and this inconsistent and often egregious record over the last 6 years, I would call on all of you to focus on Mr. Khadr as your current cause célèbre. There are, about 120 people here tonight? If you all decided you wanted to get Khadr out of Guantanamo Bay, and you all applied maximum pressure, told all your friends, wrote letters to various media outlets and to politicians of various kinds, and went and asked inconvenient questions when conservative politicians came to town, that you and yourselves could probably set him free. Such is the force of justice and truth and principle when it stands up against those who don't uphold those things. Those who violate these rights often have large armies and very deep pockets, but they cannot stand up effectively against the power of what is right. That is the great thing about international human rights and international humanitarian law. It's not all of the treaties. It's not the court judgments. It's the power of these things, rooted in principle, rooted in humanity, and rooted in morality. These things actually have power. And the treaties and the court judgments are just manifestations of that power. The power runs much deeper and much stronger. And I tell you, as someone who has seen too much of this in a relatively short life, that that's what gives me optimism. that's what gives me hope, because I know that this power is something that we can all harness. And so the only challenge for me is to get more and more people to buy into this understanding so that we collectively harness it. Because then human rights will win again. Thank you.
Michael,
opportunity to listen to it. My question is really brief. Just wanted to ask you about the term "the war on terror" from a legal point of view. Some weeks ago, I was watching YouTube, and the American historian Howard Zinn said something interesting to me, that war is terror, and in a sense, it becomes an absurdity. So, if that's the case, what are we doing in Afghanistan? If you could perhaps explain that from a legal point of view. Thank you.
There's a long history to the term war, and most of the legal content in international law was taken out of the word war through the UN Charter's prohibition of the threat or use of force. See, what happened is that states after 1928, the adoption of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, simply stopped declaring war, because under law as it was interpreted then, as long as you didn't say it was war, then you could do it. And the drafters of the UN Charter said, well, look, this is clearly not an acceptable situation, so let's not deal with the word law, let's just deal with force, the threat or the use of force. War obviously has rhetorical impact today, particularly with the general public. And the use of the term war on terror, signaled a fundamental choice of direction in terms of the response to the events of September 11, 2001. And you could just as easily and more appropriately have regarded it as a criminal matter, okay, and dealt with it in terms of international police and judicial cooperation, okay, and which was what was done, during the first attack on the World Trade Center back in the early 1990s. This is really serious, and we should all come together in the United Nations and craft solutions to the fundamental root causes of terrorism and deal with the perpetrators as criminals rather than the enemy. How different would our world be today?